Hello, everyone. So it's 3 o'clock Oslo time, and welcome to the MF Center for Advanced Study of Religion annual lecture. So I'm Lars Led Iversen. I'm the chair of the MF CASR's board. You won't hear much of me, but today we are very proud and excited to present Professor Candida Moss and to hear her lecture titled Imaginative Limits and Invisible Labor, Early Christian History in the Shadows of Erasure. Now, the MF Center for Advanced Studies of Religion is a research hub based here at MF, and we develop and communicate excellent research about religion broadly understood. In our annual lecture, we invite the scholars who we want to celebrate and who we find exciting, inspiring, and important, such as Candida here. I just want to quickly let you know how this online event will unfold from here. Okay, I will very soon hand over the word to the director of MF CASR, Liv Ingeborg Lid, who will introduce Professor Moss in more detail and her work. Professor Moss will then be invited to hold the annual lecture. When that lecture is over, we will hear two responses from our colleagues here at MF, the MF CASR Fellows, Brent Nongbury and Greg Fuster. The event will end with a conversation. We start by letting Professor Moss respond to the respondents before we open up for questions from you, the audience. There is a Q&A feature here in the Zoom room. Please use this to ask any questions that you might have. And then Professor Moss will respond to your questions until this event ends at 4:30 Oslo time. Anyway, I'll hand over the screen to the director of MF CASR Lid, to the director of MF CASR, Liv Ingeborg Lid.
Thank you so much, Lars. I would like to start by expressing how excited and proud I am that Candida Moss is our 2024 annual lecturer. Candida Moss is beyond doubt one of the most important and interesting voices, both in the field of biblical studies and in the broader fields of theology and religious studies today. She is widely recognized for her research. She's acclaimed for her public scholarship and loved by her students and mentees, as several recent awards have shown. Moss, a 2006 Yale graduate, is currently the Edward Cadbury Professor of Theology in the Department of Theology and Religion at the University of Birmingham. She is a New Testament scholar and a historian of early Christianity. Professor Moss's research record includes, among other publications, 7 books. And just listen to that, 7. I have no clue how she has been managing to do that. And a large amount of articles in peer-reviewed journals. Among the main foci of her research is early Christian martyrdom, disability, and ancient medicine. That is, various expressions of the relationship between power and the body. Another direction of her research concerns religion, politics, and the Bible in contemporary US. This interest resulted, for example, in the 2015 book Bible Nation, the United States of Hobby Lobby, co-authored with Joel Baden, and you can kind of see it there. Her most recent research interest concerns slavery in the ancient world, particularly enslaved secretaries and scribes, and how they contributed to the making of the New Testament. This is also the topic of her 2024 book, God's Ghostwriters, Enslaved Christians and the Making of the Bible, a book that is already altering the way that scholars think about ancient authorship, text production, and writing practices, among many other things. Today's lecture is called Imaginative Limits and Invisible Labor, Early Christian History in the Shadow of Erasure. And I have looked forward to this for a long, long time. So please, Candida, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lid, for that lovely invitation. I'm going to share my screen and you'll have to tell me if you can see everything correctly. I'd hate for you to be able to see my jokes before I say them. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. I'd like to thank Dr. Lid for the invitation to be here today, everyone involved in the preparations for my lecture, and all of you for attending. I'm desperately sorry that I am unable to be there in person. I have COVID and did not want to level the entire of your department. I'd particularly like to thank the respondents, Dr. Nongbury and Dr. Fuster, for taking the time to read my work in something incomplete form. My lecture today is about how we tell the history of early Christianity, and in particular, the history of the writing of the Bible, when the contributions of low-status workers have been erased. It draws upon and teases out some of the themes in my recently published book, God's Ghostwriters. And in case you aren't among the literally dozens of people who are familiar with the book, I thought I would begin there. The book project that generated this lecture emerged out of a very common, almost banal human experience. About 6 years ago, I needed reading glasses for the first time. These aren't just a prop to look smart. The purchase of an external monitor and 6 months of magnifying documents on my computer screen dragged me somewhat unwillingly to the realization that I could no longer read a small print on the physical or digital page. This in turn asked me to ask the question, how did people do this in the ancient world? Glasses have only been around since the 12th century, when the medieval polymath Hassan ibn al-Haytham, sometimes known as Al-Hazan, wrote his famous book of optics. There are some precursors to glasses. The Emperor Nero allegedly used a green stone to magnify things, or perhaps as sunglasses, and Seneca used a bowl of water. But they do not seem to have been common, or in fact, that useful, particularly for the hard work of copying things out or reading at night. How then did people with congenital vision loss, eye infections, or those like me who needed glasses by the age of 40 do their bookwork? How did those with mobility impairments like gout or arthritis navigate scrolls to turn the pages of the books that they read? Or even more uncomfortable, how did they press forefinger and thumb together in order to hold a stylus and write by hand? The answer, of course, was obvious. They used other people to read and write, perhaps biddable children whose senses tended to be keener, or as in one ancient example, a literate house guest who could be pressed into service. But more often than not, when we look into the ancient evidence, it becomes clear that most people used enslaved or formerly enslaved people to read and write. They did not only do this when impairment physically prevented them from doing otherwise. The vast majority of ancient authors seem to have dictated their writings to enslaved secretaries, had texts read aloud by professionalized readers, and had letters and other written materials duplicated by enslaved or formerly enslaved copyists. And at this juncture, and only because it is such a mouthful, I'm going to stop saying enslaved and formerly enslaved. You should just assume that when I say enslaved, I am also referring to freedmen who had previously been enslaved and had been manumitted at some point in their life. This is one of the big disjunctures between ancient Roman and Atlantic slavery. Whereas slaveholders in the American South and Caribbean went to extreme and violent lengths to prevent enslaved people from becoming literate, Roman enslavers educated enslaved people to do paperwork that they found uncomfortable, difficult, or even just bothersome. The reasons are fairly clear. Writing furiously by hand, as anyone who has ever taken a written exam will remember, hurts. You have to kind of wring out your hand to deal with the pain. Reading at night, when many Roman reading events took place, is particularly difficult as you grow older, as anyone who uses their phone's flashlight function to read a restaurant menu knows. While one might, for sentimental reasons, want to write a love letter by hand oneself, copying was particularly arduous and wasn't even seen as a respectable activity. It was just much more enjoyable, as the orator Dio Chrysostom tells us, to be read to by a trained expert who knew just how to render the lines properly. The effect of a text, he says, is enhanced when one is relieved of the preoccupation of reading it. There was, of course, another reason that people used rented scribes to read and write, and that was that they had never been formally educated themselves. This brings me to the early Christians. With the exception of Paul, whom we should note never met Jesus, the people selected by Jesus for the project of evangelizing to the Roman world, or even let's just say the Galilee, were unlikely candidates for the job. According to early Christian writings, Jesus and his inner circle came from rural Galilee. All of these men spoke probably a smattering of Greek, but none of his inner circle were formally trained. They had watched and presumably learned from Jesus, but they were outsiders, and there's no reason to think that any of them were literate unless one supposes that the descent of the Spirit at Pentecost endowed them with special literate skills. One might suppose this based on patristic argument that Acts of the Apostles does not mention anything about literacy, and historians are not in the habit of plugging the holes in our evidence through appeals to the miraculous. The more traditional one's take on the dating and authorship of the books of the New Testament, the more one needs secretaries to explain Christianity's undeniable bookishness. Tradition holds that the evangelist John was close to 100 when he wrote his gospel. Ignatius of Antioch was apparently in his 70s when he was writing. Justin Martyr suggests that the gospels were written to preserve the memories of aging apostles. And the Gospel of Mark might be a case in point. According to the 2nd century bishop Papias of Hierapolis, Mark, Peter's interpreter, recorded the apostles' memories for posterity. And these are just a few of early Christianity's more mature authors. Even if someone felt pressed to argue that Christians did not routinely use secretaries, they should concede that people of advanced age did not generally write alone prior to the invention of refractive lenses. And whatever this 16th century artist believes, those did not exist in the 1st century. This is not only about aging, however. The Apostle Paul, the most highly educated of the first followers, regularly used secretaries to compose his letters. Romans, his magnum opus, was written according to 1622 by an otherwise unknown secretary named Tertius. Paul often found himself imprisoned and was almost certainly unable to review the letters that he wrote. Because as recent research by Matthew Larson and Mark Lettany has shown, the archaeology of ancient prisons reveals that they were dark and uninviting. It's difficult to imagine how Paul would have even been able to review his writings, even if his secretaries had the resources to bribe their way inside a prison on 2 occasions to take dictation and then to bring the final form back to Paul for his review. Towards the end of his letter to the Galatians, Paul remarks on his handwriting and invites his audience to see what large letters I make when I'm writing with my own hand. The implication here is that the preceding section, what amounts to almost the entirety of the letter, had been written by someone else in a smaller script. He makes similar statements in 1 Corinthians and Colossians, if you think Colossians is Paul, suggesting that this was his standard practice. He tells us that his other letters were collaborations with his co-workers. That Paul utilizes the services of enslaved collaborators should not surprise us. This is, after all, how most people in the 1st century wrote. Now, in referring to his collaborators at all, Paul is something of an exceptional case. Because enslaved workers were seen as body parts or tools, they were not always or regularly acknowledged as participants in the writing or bookmaking process. They often come into view, as a number of classicists like Joe Howley and Sarah Blake have shown, when it is convenient to the higher status author. Otherwise, they tend to live in passive verbs that obscure their presence and contributions, or sometimes they feature only as the figurative hands or pens of their enslavers. This state of affairs means that enslaved literate workers are everywhere and nowhere in our sources. While ancient elites could and did read, most of their reading was done by equally well-educated but lower status servile individuals. When an elite writer says they consulted a text of Homer or Plato, they almost certainly had someone do it for them. The same was true of writing. Just because someone says they were writing does not mean that we should assume they held the writing implement themselves. Perhaps more likely that someone else took dictation, perhaps at high speed and compressed into shorthand, which that invisible person would later expand, revise, and edit into a finished text. Just because an enslaved worker is not noted does not mean that they were not there. At this juncture, I imagine some of you might protest only internally, because to shout it out would be very rude, and in any case, you would need Dr. Lieb to unmute you. The secretary is not an author, and that secretaries are just conduits for the will of the author. This is, after all, what Roman elites tell us. They claim that enslaved people are just hands or tongues or pens through which they extend themselves and their capabilities. Even Cicero's more affectionate statement that without Tiro, his voice is silent, is entangled with an enslaving perspective that reduces Tiro to a body part. Varro calls them speaking tools. I mention this only so that we all know that the idea of secretaries as just mouthpieces or tools ultimately derives from the world of slaveholding. We cannot just repeat it as fact without subscribing to the underlying dehumanizing logic that insists that enslaved people do not really have wills or minds of their own. I'm not sure that that's something we would want to say. Moreover, neither ancient elites nor we are entirely consistent about the erasure. Enslaved people have agency when they do something wrong. When a secretary or stenographer mangles his words, Galen will blame him for it. When an enslaved person commits a crime, they would face corporal or capital punishment according to the Roman Digest. So too, when a copyist makes a mistake, they appear in our secondary literature as incompetent or as devious corruptors of the text. It is only when enslaved people do well that they are erased from our historical accounts. The more competent they are, the less likely we are to see them. This is where things get tricky. Writing a history of enslaved literate workers and the ways in which they shaped the Bible and early Christian history is an especially difficult task. The archives of history only preserve fragmentary glimpses of their lives. Often what evidence we have is channeled through the perspectives of enslavers who claim to speak for those they had enslaved. We might ask if the perspectives and experience of enslaved workers are there to be found, or if they have been thoroughly overwritten by those who hold power. The enslaved contributions and interventions that we seek might have required a kind of agency that the conditions of enslavement made impossible. Reconstructing the experiences of enslaved people, as recent scholarship on Atlantic slavery has revealed, requires both that historians use different tools and methods and that they adjust their expectations. This process involves reading into the gaps, engaging in what historian of Atlantic slavery Saidiya Hartman calls critical fabulation, a form of history telling that is imaginative, but not untrue. The evidence is fragmented, but it is evidence. The word imagination will undoubtedly give some of you pause, but it should not. All ancient history involves imagination. We sift through the tissue of archaeological and literary material and piece together portraits that stem from ourselves as much as our evidence. For those of you who are quietly skeptical, I'd like to supply some examples. Take, to begin with, the theory of mid-20th century giant of New Testament scholarship Rudolf Bultmann that the Gospel of John was composed from a collection of sources that had gotten out of order. Bultmann hypothesized that as the evangelist, or perhaps his editor, the redactor, was writing at his desk, a gust of wind blew through the window and displaced his papers. This is an important historical argument that I actually learned in high school in England in the late 1990s. But his theory is filled with some anachronisms. To begin with, ancient authors did not use desks from which sheets of paper could be blown. We can debate desks. But speaking of writing materials, if the author was working from sources or a first edition, then these sources were inscribed on sturdier tablets, scrolls, or notebooks, rather than on single sheets of papyrus. And Bultmann himself, and I should credit Christoph Markschies for this observation, never checked with the distinguished papyrologists who worked alongside him at the University of Marburg to see if there was any actual material evidence of this sort of mix-up happening. His theory has some practical flaws that stem from an imagination informed by modern writing practice. The issue isn't that he's being imaginative. The issue is that his imagination is uninterrogated. My point is that all reconstructions of the ancient writing process are necessarily imaginative, and everyone who writes about the past should worry that they are writing about themselves. Okay, I imagine you thinking, but Bultmann's theory is just a theory, and everyone since Charles Harold Dodge has lined up to criticize him for his liberal rearrangement of the fourth gospel. Surely, uninterrogated imagination, assumptions or Bayesian priors, if you will, have not harmed something more robust, more important, something like the very subject of our inquiry. Here too, I would argue that assumptions about solitary elite authorship have done more damage than one supposed. To allow me to digress further with a second example. One area of my study on this subject has been the role of stenographers or shorthand writers in the composition of ancient literature. Every known ancient stenographer in the 1st and 2nd century CE was enslaved or formerly enslaved. In my work, I have argued that we have not integrated stenographers into our accounts of literary production, either in terms of their contribution to the content of ancient material or in terms of what their existence means for the material production of autographs, that is, first copies of the text of the New Testament. And the ramifications of this oversight, I think, are surprisingly consequential, more consequential than I realized when I wrote my book. Take, for example, the Apostle Paul, and the indisputable fact of the dictation of at least some of his letters to a series of secretaries. More likely than not, at least some of Paul's stenographers took dictation on wax tablets rather than papyri, and this mode of inscription seems particularly likely for the prison letters where the portability of tablets would have been preferable to the task. Paul's secretary then would have transferred the letter onto papyrus. The original version from the lips of Paul, however, was more likely to remain on wax tablets. The tablets do not play a role in New Testament textual criticism and have, until recently, been excluded from lists and catalogues of manuscripts of the New Testament. Even now, they only appear on an ad hoc basis. What this means, practically, is that if we had found the autographs of Paul's letters in a trash heap or a library a century ago, we would have ignored them, particularly if the tablets were inscribed in shorthand, because we, much like Paul, would not even know what was on them. Ironically, the autographs of Paul's letters themselves would not have been incorporated into conversations attempting to establish the original text of the Pauline epistles. You can blame Kurt Aland if you must. A hyperactive subdiscipline founded 500 years ago with the goal of recovering the original words of the apostles and the earliest text of the New Testament has, because of a failure of imagination, sabotaged its own project. To adapt the words of celebrated archaeologist and antiquities trafficker Indiana Jones, we have been digging in the wrong place. Uninterrogated imagination that fails to account for the exploitation of enslaved workers does not only affect arguments about the text, it circumscribes the text itself. It delineates our very field of study. Now, my point is not that I think that there are original autographs of the Pauline epistles or other early Christian texts out there to be found, but if any Christian billionaires would like to pay me to find them, then I'm happy to do so. Chances are that the tablets were reused. My point is actually that by ignoring invisible workers, we have committed grave and persistent historical mistakes. It is not the case that those of us who work on invisible labor, women or other marginalized groups are simply making things up, while others are doing real history. We are all speculating. It's just that some of us are being more transparent about it. Oh, sorry. Now, thus far, the only problem with critical fabulation or interrogated imagination that I have flagged for you is one of evidence. Many of you might wonder if the problems here are purely practical. A dearth of evidence means that we cannot really say much, and thus anything we can say is historically problematic. The real issue, I would contend, is ethical, and we are caught here between two sets of ethical concerns. On the one hand, we could choose to say nothing. Can't speak about the contributions of enslaved people because we just don't know. We don't have the evidence. To fill the lacuna in our evidence, we could, as I have, turn to other disciplines like cognitive psychology, sociology, histories of labor or slavery, osteoarchaeology, and so on to help us recreate narratives. but we should worry that we are limited by our own imagination. In using the experiences of others from different periods of time, any historian runs the risk of turning from ventriloquists looking down the well of history and seeing ourselves reflected back to ourselves into puppeteers, forcing different periods of history to speak to one another like a very niche Punch and Judy show. But if we do not try to turn the invisible contributors, pictured as writing implements and hands, back into people, then these individuals and their legacy will remain abstract. I, for example, did not need to give anyone names. I could have discussed just the importance of an abstract principle, but if I had done that, I would have obscured the power dynamics that turned the cogs of ancient society and the very real people who felt their presence and their pressure. Abstractions can be useful, but they are also shorn of humanity. Say nothing and enslaved people fade back into the background. Individuals with names found almost exclusively among enslaved people like Tertius or Epaphroditus turn into freeborn volunteers, and pretty soon we find ourselves describing the letter to the Romans as Paul's, even though the letter itself presents a more complicated history of its writing. Say nothing and we end up with this admittedly very pretty Renaissance painting. History abhors a vacuum. Until we are comfortable saying that we simply do not know, then an anachronistic and despotic account of ancient writing that we have inherited from the powerful enslavers of the ancient world will continue to win the day. On the other hand, as we attempt to use flimsy evidence to speak about marginalized experiences, we find ourselves dealing with untrustworthy sources. Much of the extant material is problematic. As numerous scholars of Atlantic slavery have shown, the violence of slavery's archives lies in erasure. Often, as Marisa Fuentes has written in her book, Dispossessed Lives, the archive that produced an enslaved individual's material life was created and sustained by white colonial power. That power is then only reinscribed in subsequent narratives, including academic narratives of a person's lived experiences. To give an example of how Fuentes' argument holds for ancient slavery, we might say that the nature of the so-called affectionate relationship between Tiro and Cicero is articulated by Tiro's enslaver. We actually don't know how Tiro experienced it. He's a complicated example because he's a writer. But I mention him because the characterization of their relationship is rehearsed in modern scholarly narratives that see Roman slavery as kind or magnanimous. This is a form of instrumentalization, a selective reading of ancient evidence that does ideological work for those who want to cling to the idea of Roman moral superiority. Even in New Testament scholarship, we need to be attentive to the selective ways in which people tend to instrumentalize marginalized people in their history telling. To explain what I mean by this, I would like to turn to two conversations that leverage enslaved literate workers for scholarly goals in different ways. The first is the role of women in the production of ancient literature. As anyone trained in history will have heard, most people in antiquity could not read or write. In addition, and with the exception of people like Kim Heinz-Eitzen, Uti Leitipu, Kat Lambert, Christina Kreinecker, Esther Brownsmith, and Mika Ahuvia, it is a truism in scholarship on ancient literacy that even more so than men, the overwhelming majority of women in antiquity could not read. Some exceptional women may have learned philosophy, but there's a general consensus that only elite women were educated, and only then in what Walter Ameling has called a lesser form of education. This means that examples like this roof tile from Petra Bubonte, in which two enslaved literate women, one of whom was bilingual, crafted a kind of friendship plaque, are shuffled to the side. So too, these inscribed spindles are presumed to be love tokens crafted for women by literate men, even though, presumably, the women must have been able to read them. In describing the state of the field, we might think here particularly of Henri Marou's 1948 monograph, but equally influential in the past 25 years is the work of Columbia classicist William Harris. Forgive me for including him here. I do not bring him here to praise him. Harris's influence drips into the study of early Christianity. I think here of Harry Gamble's work, but also of many other studies of book and reading culture among early Christians that conclude that literacy among women was below, to quote Harris, perhaps far below 10% in the Roman period. Interestingly, Harris is one of the few scholars to think about the constructive role of enslaved literate workers in women's writing. To give you but one example, he writes that there are presumably some fully literate women in Hellenistic papyri, and we might expect to find them well represented among the writers of private letters. However, the tacit use of third parties and scribes for the writing of letters makes it difficult, perhaps impossible, to isolate clear cases. So in this example of a woman writing to her husband in 168 BCE, there's no hint that she's relying on an intermediary, but even here, the possibility cannot be excluded. Now, to be fair to Harris, he is interested in the question of who can read and write, not who had access to the knowledge encoded in text, which might be relayed to them by an intermediary. His statement is absolutely correct. Just because a woman does not mention that she was dictating to someone does not mean that she wrote with her own hand. But the erasure of dictation and the elimination of intermediaries, and particularly servile intermediaries, is a feature of all ancient writing practice. It is certainly correct that fewer women were literate than men in antiquity. But what is true of women here in this statement is also true of men. Harris invokes enslaved workers to erase the possibility of women's participation in letter writing culture. He is not particularly interested in these scribes for their own sake, nor does he note the evidence for enslaved female stenographers and readers, which exists. His argument is a selective and inconsistent instrumentalization of enslaved workers that serves his broader agenda of invalidating examples of women's writing. One marginalized and erased group is used to secure the erasure of another. My second example is a conversation about forged texts in early Christianity. And here I would like to acknowledge my indebtedness to particularly Jeremiah Coogan, but also Joe Howley, and the several pieces on forgery, social status, and labor that I co-authored with them in New Testament studies and Arethusa. I selected this example of forgery and the conversation about forgery because I know that there's a particular kind of historian, and some of you may count yourself in that number, who thinks that historiography is not really about ethics. We just do history, we don't do ethics here. But the academic conversation about forgery is already deeply inflected by ethical concerns. Predominantly, the question, was it or was it not socially and morally acceptable to write in the name of another person in antiquity? In the Roman Mediterranean, literate people regularly wrote in the names of other, usually better known individuals. And that is an indisputable fact that has resulted in an academic cottage industry devoted to debating authenticity and identifying ancient forgeries. And throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, many scholars working within this paradigm kind of accepted a compromise that there is deceitful forgery in antiquity, but many Christian forgeries should be categorized as pious frauds or sort of genuine religious pseudepigraphy. It's much more complicated than I'm relaying. But in this account, those who composed these Christian forgeries did not seek to deceive others. They were instead genuinely inspired by a religious figure or spiritual entity. Thus, there was no real deception. This détente ended with the publication of a series of works by Jed Weirich, Bart Ehrman, and Hugo Mendes that each link pseudepigraphy or forgery to deceit and to various degrees polemic. Central for their argument is the idea that writing is a solitary, punctiliar activity that does not involve editing, revision, or post-compositional intervention. To keep the focus on enslaved literate workers, they entered this conversation in the work of those scholars who want to defend the New Testament against accusations of inauthenticity. Scholars like Randolph Richards have argued that Paul's use of secretaries can explain why some Pauline epistles sound different from others. Against them, people like Ehrman argue that secretaries change nothing, about an author's words and were instead mere conduits for the author. I, of course, think Ehrman is sorely mistaken and has absorbed and reproduced the enslaving logics of ancient authorial discourse, but at least he's consistent on the question of secretaries, if not secretaries and copyists. My question to those who think secretaries can rescue the Deutero-Paulines from disrepute is why secretaries have only been brought to bear upon those texts with bad reputations. If secretaries might have influenced the style and tone of Colossians, 2 Thessalonians, or 2 Timothy, would they not also have affected the content of Galatians or Romans? Many scholars welcome secretaries to the proverbial table in order to authorize the pastorals or Deutero-Paulines, only to dismiss them from their interpretation of those texts. This does not seem entirely consistent to me, and it does not really seem to be about enslaved secretaries at all. It is about instrumentalizing, or rather re-instrumentalizing, enslaved secretaries for academic use. Focusing on the social status of the writers who created the New Testament certainly can diffuse the inflammatory conversations that currently surround disagreement about forgery in writing in the names of others in antiquity. When enslaved people wrote in the names of authors as a part of their servile work or job description, their forgery was less about deceit and more about status or a lack thereof. A focus on enslavement and enslaved people reframes the phenomenon. Just as theft is sometimes about hunger and desperation rather than greed, forgery is sometimes about a lack of access to power. It is, as scholars of early modern forgery have written, a form of resistance. Perhaps this should be where our ethical focus lies. But even if there are meaningful interventions to be made in this academic debate, the point of centering enslavement and enslaved workers should not be to fix the problems that modern interpreters currently have when they read the Bible, nor should it be about the explanatory power that enslavement has when it comes to narrating the history of Christianity. We should see invisible workers everywhere, not only when they allow us to advance a theory about women's supposed illiteracy or protect the New Testament from certain kinds of attack. Centering enslavement is about justice, credit, and recognizing harm. It is about trying to make visible those whom the archive of history has rendered invisible. It is about real people. It is true, then, that our evidence is flimsy, that our imaginations are flawed. And yet, despite these impediments, invisible workers were still there. Once we know that, then we have a moral obligation to recognize their presence, their contributions, and their genius, and to try, despite the many limitations in our evidence and imagination, to describe their world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Candida Moss. That was fascinating and well presented, and I'm sure everyone else enjoyed it. Now, we're going to have now the two respondents. First, Professor Brett Longbury, and then Dr. Greg Fuster. While the respondents are responding, and afterwards, please remember that you can place your questions in the Q&A. You can do so at any time, and we're looking forward to that. But now, it is my honor to hand over the word for our first respondent. Please, Brent.
Great. Thanks. I'll just get my screen going here. So, screen look good? Great. So, thank you to the organizers for the invitation, and thank you to Professor Moss for this wonderful talk. Yeah, there's so much to chew on here, but I'm just going to focus in on a couple of things. So I've been reading Professor Moss's work for a while. She's been working on this topic for a few years now, and I think for those of us in the field of early Christianity, her work is changing the way that a lot of us approach our sources and kind of think of what we're doing with our scholarship. So for the last 20 years, I've been working on early Christian manuscripts. I've been thinking about their materiality, their structure, their histories as objects. I've been thinking about writing surfaces, papyrus, parchment, bindings, inks, how these manuscripts ended up where they are now, the antiquities market, all of these kinds of things. Paleography, that is handwriting, the question of how we establish dates for manuscripts. So I'm very accustomed to thinking about early Christian manuscripts as physical objects, as more than just carriers of text. But the issues that Professor Moss raises in her paper this afternoon, in her recent book and other articles, all of this has pushed me to think a lot more carefully about the production of manuscripts and the human labor that's involved in that production. So in this short response, I just want to dwell on two examples of irony that Moss mentioned in her paper. And the first of these concerns autographs. So what we think of as an author's working copy of a text. So as Professor Moss notes, our ancient literary sources tell us that these kinds of drafts would often be copied into wax tablets, which are very easy to erase and then to use again over and over. And these tablets were sometimes produced in fairly large sets, so you could get a substantial amount of writing in here, especially if you're using shorthand. You could fit a lot into these tablets. But of course, as Moss points out, they would be erased and then reused to write the next draft. But in some cases, this authorial drafting process seems to have taken place on papyrus rolls as well. So scholars have identified a small handful of these so-called autographs that have survived from antiquity. So I want to ask the question of how we identify them. How do we know an autograph when we see it? So here's one example. This is a papyrus fragment that was found in the trash heaps of an Egyptian city called Oxyrhynchus. It was identified by a pioneering papyrologist named Arthur Hunt, and it's a fragmentary Christian text that seems to be a dialogue between a Christian and a Jew, debating about the meaning of the Hebrew scriptures. So, how did Arthur Hunt identify it as an author's copy? So this is what he wrote in his edition of the papyrus. The authorship of the fragment remains unknown, but there is some reason for attributing it to a local writer. This is suggested by the frequent alterations which have been made in the text, apparently by the original hand, which are difficult to explain except on the hypothesis that we have here a fragment of the author's own manuscript. So the changes to which Hunt refers are things like the replacement of words with synonyms. In the close-up here, the word graphon, writings, has been crossed out. You can kind of see the phi there underneath all the black ink. So that word's been crossed out, and it's been replaced above the line with the word logion, so sayings instead of writings. So these aren't copying errors. These aren't the kind of mistakes that you make with words that look similar or that sound similar. These are different choices in the act of composition. So that's the first irony. How did Hunt identify an author's copy as an autograph? Because he saw alterations, he saw variations. So the textual critics of the 19th century were looking for a singular, original text to speak with a clear and authoritative voice. But in practice, the way that scholars identify an ancient author's autograph copy of a text is by observing the presence of substantial erasures. and corrections, textual variants. So I think what Moss's work provokes us to think about is how many people are behind the production of an artifact like this. So she mentioned in her talk the experience of taking a written exam and shaking out the hand because it's painful. So any of us who did those exams, will think this process of reconsidering our vocabulary and crossing out a word and putting in a better one is a kind of a solitary activity. But I think that's exactly an example of this, our modern imagination. And so the evidence that Moss brings to the table, I think, should keep us open to imagining other scenarios, including the possibility of a scribe simultaneously taking dictation and changing or improving a text along the way. So I move now to a second example, a second example of irony that is also connected to invisibility, but in a slightly different way. So this time it's not the producers of the text, but the people who cared for a manuscript after its production. So this is one of my favorite examples. It's a papyrus from Egypt that is now in London, and it contains the books of the Iliad. So something happened to this portion of the roll containing the end of the last column of book 23 and the beginning of book 24, the first column of book 24. So that's what we're looking at here. You might be able to see here, we've got the end of book 23, and then we have the remains of a closing title down here. And you may be able to see there's a difference in the color of the papyrus here from one side to the other, and then a darker ink that's used here at the end of this line. So that's what we think happened here is this roll broke off at this point. We lost this column and the end of the other column. And then a repair took place and the missing text was supplied. So the original editor of this papyrus, Sir Frederick Kenyon, he issued a pretty harsh judgment of the work of the repair person. So about the main text, he was very happy. He says, very clear and not ungraceful, well written, a good reproduction. But for the repaired portion, it's done with extreme negligence or ignorance, full of blunders, practically valueless. But if we zoom in and look at the damaged end of this first column, we can see that this darker ink that's used by the person who repaired the manuscript fills up the end of all the lines. But then we can also observe that there's a line at the bottom here that's written in the same darker ink that extends all the way across the break in the papyrus. So if we zoom in further, we can see that between two of the lines in the text, the person who did the repairs added a word here, kato, meaning see below, and then added this line of text below the column. So it turns out that Kenyon's negligent and ignorant repair person noticed that the original copyist had left out a line of the Iliad. After recopying the ends of all the damaged lines, the repair person added in the missing line with a note pointing out the proper place to insert it. So the repair person may have been a bit more competent than Sir Frederick reckoned. But the fact is this repair is noticeable. The person who copied this replacement column was a decent writer, but you can see how the evenness of the lines deteriorates as we progress from the top of the page down to the bottom of the column. And things are visibly getting quite messy when we reach the end. But then here's the second irony. If the repair person had done an excellent job, had perfectly mimicked the handwriting of the original copyist, had better matched the color of the original papyrus, we probably would not have noticed that the repairs happened at all. As Moss puts it, it's only when the enslaved people do well that they're erased from our historical accounts. The more competent they are, the less likely we are to see them. So this irony, or even paradox, makes this kind of exercise very challenging. Or as Moss has noted, even when we get a glimpse of this labor, how do we know the social status of these people who are carrying it out? Occasionally we can see things like records like this will, in which enslaved people are part of the property that's being transferred. In this case, they include a grammateus, that is a scribe, a notarius, a shorthand writer, and a prokerographos, a secretary. But beyond their names and occupations, these kinds of slivers of evidence don't tell us very much. But these are the slivers of evidence that we have, and I think Moss gives us a really inspiring model for how to work with this kind of frustratingly fragmentary evidence. And it's a model that has a dose of imagination and a dose of humility. So I will stop there. Thank you very much again, Candida, for the paper, and to the organizers for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Brent. So without much further ado, I'll just hand over the word to Greg. Sort out the screens there. Excellent.
Yeah.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone, and good to be here today at the MF CASR annual lecture. And I'm grateful to Ingeborg for the invitation to respond, and especially to Professor Moss for her thought-provoking presentation today. I want to begin my response today with a film reference. How many of you have seen the 2009 film Agora? Agora tells the story of Hypatia, a pagan philosopher and mathematician living in Alexandria around the turn of the 4th century, and her eventual demise during one of its infamous Christian riots. I love this movie. As a scholar of ancient intellectual culture, religion, and history of the book, it scratches all my itches. And the filmmakers do a wonderful job, I think, in capturing the intellectual life of ancient Alexandria. Some of my favorite moments include scenes of teaching where Hypatia lectures to a room full of sons of aristocrats and clerics. There they are taking notes on their wax tablets, like the ones that Brent showed you. And I enjoy one scene of reading by a priest from a book of Paul's letters, where we catch a glimpse of the pages written in continuous Greek majuscule script. Enslaved laborers also make meaningful appearances throughout the film. Wearing their characteristic iron collars, we see enslaved men and women completing domestic tasks and receiving violent punishment. And we also encounter them in intellectual context. In one scene, Hypatia invites a young enslaved man named David to explain to the students the heliocentric theory of the solar system. And Hypatia makes the quip that at least someone has been paying attention in class. Throughout the film, Hypatia also is accompanied by Aspasius, an older man who becomes a crucial partner in Hypatia's recognition of elliptical orbits. In a film about the religious politics of ancient intellectual culture, we are reminded of how educated and enslaved workers are deeply entangled in ancient knowledge production. Now, Agora represents for me a traditional scholarly knowledge about the contribution of enslaved workers to ancient textual production, including the New Testament. It is not a mystery to us that Rome was a slave society. We all know that figures like Tiro were involved in composing Cicero's speeches and letters, and some of us have even suspected that Tertius was an enslaved scribe. But like the film Agora, many of us have been quite satisfied with that status quo. We feel like we understand the ancient situation. We're happy to give famous slaves like Tiro or the fictional Aspasius their due. And we are even quite satisfied to imagine close and beneficent relationships between enslaved and enslaver, one that transcends their social distinction. So Hypatia embraces Aspasius after they make their discovery. It's a beautiful scene. How many of us imagine the same between Paul and Tertius, or Paul and Onesimus? But enter Professor Moss's work. Her book, God's Library, her article, The Secretary, and her lecture today. This work should challenge New Testament scholars, and especially those of us who thought we had a critical handle on the role that enslaved laborers played in textual production and the enslaver logic that permeates so many dimensions of cultural production. Because it turns out, as we have heard today, that we weren't actually being critical enough of the ancient data and in our representations of it. Professor Moss has taught us to look more closely into the ancient data, and she has challenged us to realize just how many figures have been made invisible by enslavers' descriptions of their textual activity and our modern tendency to reproduce it. This challenge has caused me to view Agora with different eyes. Previously, my critically trained eye would notice that in the scene of reading, the book is made of parchment. But this is Egypt we're talking about, so of course it should be a papyrus book. But now I notice new things. Why is it that the priest himself is reading from Paul's book? We know now that reading the continuous majuscule script would probably have been too difficult for him to read. More likely, the priest would have had a specially trained enslaved reader to do the enunciation for him. And in those classroom scenes where young Davis deftly explains heliocentrism, why is he the only enslaved person in the room? We learned from Professor Moss that the young men in the classroom are not there alone. They would likely have been accompanied by their own personal slave who participated in the lessons and aided their young enslaver. These are instances of erasure and transposition, attributing labor performed by another onto the high-status individual. Like Agora, the New Testament and its history of transmission and use is full of erasures and transpositions. We've known about Tertius, sure, but who else are we missing? Not only has Professor Moss sort of realigned the way we think about these familiar characters, she has also pushed us to be increasingly critical and discerning in our practice of historical reconstruction. Today's lecture is an encouragement for us not to be satisfied with the status quo, but to read our ancient sources with new eyes. Now, accuracy in historical reconstruction is, I think, a widely shared scholarly value. Who wants to advocate for a picture of the past that is missing pieces or full of misrepresentations? But today's lecture has also invited us to consider ethical implications involved in working with ancient literature. Ethics holds a tenuous place in the humanistic study of religion. I think that we feel deeply about the moral value that accompanies scholarship in the humanities, but ethics can also feel like the domain of normative theology rather than the domain of the critical study of religion. In any case, I've never had to fill out an ethics review for a research project. And unlike my social scientist colleagues, I do not work with living human interlocutors who can potentially be exploited in the scholarly process. But Professor Moss has shown us that there is a deeply ethical imperative in our work, associated with our capacity to replicate erasure in our historiographical practices and to search for invisible voices in insensitive or also harmful ways. As I've listened to today's lecture and considered Professor Moss's written work on the subject, I've also done so with an eye and an ear to some of her earlier work that touches on matters pertaining to early Christian textuality. And it raises, I think, some related ethical issues. In 2017, Professor Moss published a book called Bible Nation, which looks at the rise and influence of the Green family on the study of the Bible in the United States of America. In the book, Moss and Joel Baden, her co-author, can't forget about those, track how Steve Green, the founder of the craft store Hobby Lobby, has used his massive wealth to tell a story about the Bible. He developed homeschooling curricula that placed biblical authority at its center, which was really an effort to promote an evangelical worldview predicated on an evangelical bibliology. And he also used his fortune to establish the Green Scholars Initiative, purchasing ancient papyrus manuscripts and other antiquities for young scholars to study. Through their study, they could once again affirm an evangelical bibliology, from the Bible's inerrant composition by the apostles to its faithful preservation down to today in the shape of the Protestant English Bible. The normativizing of evangelical perspectives on the Bible offers one challenge for the Green Initiative. The other is that the vast majority of the papyri were stolen from another museum, looted from conflict zones, and purchased on the black market. Now, many scholars, myself included, have tried to steer clear of the Green Scholars bubble. But why? Many of us saw dubious motives at work, a religious worldview we did not align with, and some of us had serious reservations about where the manuscripts came from. We recognized an ethical imperative at work in our scholarship. We did not want to participate in any way in the illegalities and immoralities of the economy of the black market, and Professor Moss's book helped to make that ethical imperative and its context clear. Now, it is also important to acknowledge that the Green papyri are not the only fraught manuscripts out there. Papyrus collections in general entered the European and North American collections under colonial regimes of extraction and exploitation. This goes for the collection down the street at the University of Oslo and the collection in Toronto that I worked with before coming here to MF. And like the example I gave above about the film Agora, those of us who work with papyrus manuscripts have always known about where they came from and how they got from Egypt to Europe. Sometimes we hide the truth using passive constructions, just like in Slaver's discourse. Papyri were acquired by the ex-library, but we know and have been satisfied with that status quo. But since the work of Professor Moss and many others in the field, many of us working with papyrus manuscripts, the letters of Paul or the Gospels, wrestle with our ethical responsibility. What does it mean to engage with manuscripts, which are the cultural heritage of a colonized people? What does it mean to tell stories about a past that matters to us and matters to others without ignoring the colonial and extractive paths in which they are equally entangled? I say all this to raise the point that working with ancient literature is more challenging than it used to be on ethical grounds. It should no longer be permissible to overlook the role of enslaved workers in the production and transmission of literature, sacred or otherwise. And it should no longer be permissible to ignore the conditions that supply us textual scholars with our raw data. Papyrus manuscripts, which, as Brent has already mentioned, were probably made by enslaved experts in the first place. These issues are, to my mind, closely entangled, and because, Professor Moss, you have been instrumental in drawing attention to both of these ethical aspects, I'm curious to hear how you imagine their relationship in your own work and imagination. How do you envision an ethics of textual scholarship in all its breadth and with all its complexity? And how can we reflect that tension between saying nothing and saying something? I think that's probably time, so I will leave it there, and thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Professors Moss and Nongbri and Fuster. This was highly interesting. And we turn now to the second part of this annual lecture, where we hope for more, interaction. And I would love to start by allowing Professor Moss to answer Fuster and Nongbri and answer to their responses, please.
Let me start by saying thank you to both Brent and Greg for their responses. I greatly admire your work. Greg, your dissertation was incredible, and I cannot wait to see the book. And I really enjoyed reading God's Library, as well as your work on religion, Brent. So, it's enormously humbling to get positive responses from scholars of your caliber. And I'll start with what Fred raised with the questions about autographs. And I think when it comes to autographs, you're raising some really interesting questions about where an autograph lives. Like, what's an autograph? Where does it live? I can imagine that if I was put in a room with actual text critics and I raised the issue about Black Sabbath, who said, well, no, you want the real first draft, the draft Paul authorized, to use Timothy Johnson's model of authorship. An author is someone who authorizes. And in which case we're talking about something that was dictated to one person who then went away to a different room, took it from shorthand, put it into longhand, maybe edited it then before coming out to Paul. Maybe a different person then copied it out. I don't know. And then we would have at least two copies, the one that Paul presumably kept, and then the one that he sent. So I don't, at this juncture, an autograph is clearly a collaborative document produced over some period of time, which is very different than the autograph I thought about. And I think when it comes to copyists have had an extremely bad reputation for a long time, beginning, I'm going to say, he's probably not the first, but modern Luther, who sees copyists as the heirs to, Jewish scribes and papist monks, the combination of anti-Catholicism and anti-Semitism in his description of copyists as sort of bad, and the apostles themselves as the stenographers of the Holy Spirit. Since then, we have been very content to malign copyists for their work, ignoring, of course, all the curatorial work they do that you so beautifully pointed to. It's not even clear to me that we would have these texts were it not for the kind of curatorial expertise and care and attention that they pay to these manuscripts. And so I think copyists are ripe for redescription. For sure. As is just the question of what an autograph is, what we're looking for. I realize that many text critics are beyond looking for an original text, but that was the original goal. I thought those were really interesting examples. And I will say that when it comes to the social status of the stenographer, when people have looked for that before, they've looked at stenographers over a 500-year period because they really cared about church councils and the stenographers there. And there you see a lot of freeborn stenographers. But if you just look at the period in which the New Testament is being composed and copied, every single stenographer, with the exception of one who happens to be a woman who seems to be the daughter of a freedman, all of them are enslaved or formerly enslaved. And so when you see people say, well, it seems to be sort of servile, but we have all of these other examples, what they really mean is from the 4th century, from the 5th century, from a completely different period. Dr. Fuster, thank you so much for your response. I think you're absolutely right. We have to think about, I think most of us were told not to use passive verbs in our writing at some juncture in our education. And certainly I think we have to think about the kinds of work that passive verbs are doing in our research principles as well. I hadn't connected my ethical concerns in Bible Nation to my ethical concerns here. But I think they are ethical concerns. And I think one of the reasons I feel that I can use the language that sounds like normative theology is because I have a reputation for being a little iconoclastic. No one looks at me and thinks that I'm trying to smuggle some conservative Christian values into the scholarship. It sort of empowers me to talk about ethics from a more, shall we say, humanistic perspective. I love that you say that now we have to think about these. One concern I've had both for Bible Nation and for this book is that what would happen is people would read it. They would say, well, she has some points. And then my argument would end up in a footnote where people write about Romans. They said, well, of course, Moses talked about secretaries, but we can't really do anything here. So I'm just going to ignore that and go back to talking about Paul or John or Ignatius, whomever it is, that we would sort of check them in a footnote and then go back to ignoring them in the same way as we're not entirely transparent about our own dependence on other scholars when we publish. When you look at acknowledgements in books, there's a lot of name checking prominent scholars and, copy editors and indexers, the bought and paid for labor, only get invoked in exceptional cases, I would say. Sometimes we see students acknowledged, but mostly we don't. So I think that I would love to see it be the norm that we talk about collaborative labor, and that we embrace the uncertainties and that we acknowledge transparently the amount of speculation in our work. I think that would be good. And more importantly, I think it would make us better historians. I'm sure other people have things to say.
Thank you so much. So again, if you do have questions, please use the Q&A function and we will read your questions here. So while we're waiting for that, I have a few questions, or at least I'll start with one, and I'll have to choose. So I think I would like to follow up on this idea of broadening, like the thought of how many people are involved that both you and Brent Nongbury were talking about. And I would love to take then the point of departure as, what is it that we have access to today? Because like in terms of however we think about what really happened, what we have are like some manuscripts, for instance, and that's where we start. And I'm also then drawing on some of the ideas that we're discussing in the Books Not Only by Title project some years ago, where we were thinking about, text production as something that included more people, and not only those who kind of inscribed something or those who came up with the idea of a text or or of work, so like author, writer, and so on, but also then to think about those who financed this, those who ordered the production of a certain manuscript, those who prepared the materials, those who did the writing, those who did the corrections, those who kept it safe, those who owned it and cared for it, and so on, which is all of those roles that together is what makes it possible for us today to access a text. So that would then be like a way of thinking about text production that includes both more people and more sittings or more time. And I would love to hear what you think about that.
I'm sure it's clear I'm in complete agreement. It is more time and it's more sittings. I would love to see more work written. I think of Matthew Lawson's article on the life of Codex Bobiensis, an autobiography of a manuscript. Love that article. And I'd love to see more articles written in that vein about individual copyists. I know that's a thing that you're thinking about, where we have that data. I think the focus on people is important. It's once we get abstract, once we move away from material manuscripts and people that we know are there, even if they're invisible, that we get into trouble. Because that's when everything just sort of gets a little fuzzy and we just default to our practices. So I think we do need to talk about the amount of time, about people who are fixing manuscripts, organizing them, about the people who created the paratexts that have framed how we read these texts to this day. The Eusebian apparatus seems unimportant, which is, the tables that allowed people in antiquity to pair up gospel narratives, say the feeding of the 5,000. That feels instinctive. But should the prologue of the Gospel of John be set alongside an infancy narrative? Are those the same story? Eusebius and his team thought so, and now we see it all as the same story. It's why we read the text the way we read it. And it could seem unimportant precisely because it's so instinctive. And that's just testimony to its success. And so I think thinking about, it's clearly not just Eusebius, you need a lot of people to put that together. And thinking about the amount of time and the amount of people we need would really augment something like a conversation about the synoptic problem or source criticism of the Pentateuch. Like, how many people do you need to put J, E, D, and P together? Feels like 5. At least. And that would really change whether or not that theory makes any sense if you have 5 people in the room. So I think we have an ethical obligation. I think it's just intrinsically interesting, right? Isn't it interesting to think about the people who are doing this work and how it was done? It is. But also it would radically alter some really important theories in our field that, we continue to teach in our introductory courses. In response, I just say, yes, of course, Liv, I agree with you. I'm among friends.
And I have another question for you as well. You were discussing, the issue of fragmentary evidence in your lecture. And what I would love to hear a little bit more about is when we turn from antiquity to other periods, what do we see then?
Yeah. So this is a problem. And I understand if everyone sort of recoils in slight horror at the idea of looking at other periods of history to try and ascertain how interventions might have been made. But we don't have the data for antiquity. We have some data. Every time you see an ancient elite person accuse someone else of overly relying on their slaves or being influenced by their slaves or their slaves writing the things for them, you know that it's happening and there are concerns about it. And those concerns are exactly why we can't see it, because admitting to being influenced by your slaves, with your enslaved workers, would be like admitting to a sort of clandestine relationship with them. It is clandestine. In other periods, and I went and looked at a lot of periods of history where we have more data, so people start doing the kind of linguistic computational analysis you can do with a lot of material, then all of a sudden you can see that secretaries do collaborate in really thorough ways. They are making interventions. And in fact, in every period of book labor, book history I looked at, the lower status collaborator, the copy editors, the printers, all of those people, they're all making substantive changes. They are saving authors from huge embarrassment. So we know that it's happening. We even know why they do it, because there are interviews with them in more recent periods who say that they have to do it. It's so mind-numbingly boring to do data entry. I use the quote that you have to do things to entertain yourself. There's one example of an interview that I read where she's putting in data. It's the banking, like in a back office. And I actually held this job myself. And to entertain herself, she goes from, instead of just putting 9% as 9%, she'll put 9.0%, 9.00%. She'll write it out in words just to see how many characters she can get in the box. And she says she has to do this. If you don't find ways to entertain yourself, you couldn't live like this. And all I can think when I read that is, I know what we would think if we saw all of these manuscripts with different numbers on them. We would not say one person was trying to entertain themselves. And yet we know that's why she did it. So I think that those examples are useful for challenging us to think beyond the paradigms of corruption or theological fixing. I think there are other things, as the life of the copyist is important.
So, Greg, do you have a question there?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's a bad reading of your work or a bad listening to your lecture that just sort of divides the world in binary terms. There's the enslaved and the enslaver. But you gestured at the beginning of your talk that there's enslaved people and formerly enslaved people, and in your work you also talk about sort of a more complex society where people of differing statuses have slaves, and I think we should be able to imagine a difference between someone like Paul and what his relationship to Tertius might be compared to someone like Cicero, who's at a much higher kind of like social class. So at the risk of doing the bad reading, I'm just wondering if you could say just a little bit more about that kind of sociological complexity and I guess, what that does for our understanding of the New Testament, etc.
Yeah, it is complex. And I think one of the things that makes people really uncomfortable and this is true in Caribbean and Atlantic slavery too, is freedmen who have enslaved workers that they treat horrendously. Marisa Fuentes has a lot of examples of this. I think one thing we have to be aware of is that there is an elite discourse that it is preferable to be in the household of an elite enslaver than a freedman enslaver because you'll be treated better. That freedmen are more violent or more brutal or something. So you have to be aware of that. But there are all kinds of complexities. It is true that if you're an enslaved worker in an elite household in a situation where there's a famine, you're probably going to have more food and housing security. It's a very complicated society. It's not the case that simply being free makes your life good. And there are all kinds of other things that make this a much more intersectional thing, like gender. When people talk about how slavery was better in the Roman world, what they really mean is for men. Because women were much more frequently manumitted. It happened later in life. They were more likely to die in childbirth. There are all kinds of things that affect them, that they were much less likely to be educated and then be able to purchase freedom. So it is really complicated. And we have enslaved people purchasing other enslaved people as investments for themselves. It's not as if this is not some straightforward, the powerful, the oppressed, and we can always side with the oppressed. It's a very complicated world, just as it is today. And we do, as I think you're asking me, we need to be attentive to that.
So Brent, please.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to come back to something related to what you were talking about with like the JEDP and these sort of classic formulations, because I think a lot of what your work does complicates these things in ways like just the standard introductory stuff in a New Testament textbook, the synoptic problem. You talked today about Paul's letters. Like all of these questions, pseudepigraphy. How is this materialized in your teaching? Like, how do you take students through the synoptic problem, or do you?
So, I don't teach that much, and I actually don't teach Introduction to the New Testament, though I'd love to. But I've been thinking about it. Like, how will I teach my New Testament introduction now? And I think I'm going to start with the people who wrote your I'm going to start backwards from manuscripts. I'm going to say the people who wrote your New Testament down were enslaved. And I did once, it only happened one time, someone said, I don't even really know why it matters if enslaved people collaborate on this text. But from a scholar, just in case you were wondering, and I was like, I don't know, do you think whether or not the author was Jewish or Roman or where it was written matters? I think, do you just not think authorial identity matters? He did. He just didn't think that enslaved people, that would matter. And so I would certainly want to, in my book, I have examples of like, how would we reread the story if we thought of it as a collaboration between an enslaved person and a non-enslaved person? And I have those examples, and some reviewers have said, well, these are very speculative. To which I would say, yes, I know. And so was your reading if you were talking about the author as Jewish or Greek, or it was written in Antioch or wherever it was. We were all doing speculation. So if I get to teach Introduction to the New Testament again, I will change it. And I will integrate this more than that 1 week at the end where we talk about enslaved people / women / alternative approaches to traditional historical criticism. I hope it will be thoroughly threaded throughout the whole class. And I hope that everyone else will do that. When I wrote the book, I wrote as a kind of journey from writing I had to have my Jesus chapter. It was mandated by my editor, but I sort of wanted to follow the life story of the New Testament text from writing and copying to reading, so that if someone wanted to use it in a New Testament class, they could. And now no one will. but I try. I hope that people would use it in their intro to the New Testament classes rather than just as like a niche book you read at the end.
So I have a final question for you. I think that what you've done in your book, and which you've also illustrated so well in the lecture here, is that you've kind of shed important light on a major blind spot that has been there. What I would love to hear you think about with us is what you would, if you, like in your dreams, what would be kind of the desired continuation of this work in the field? Like in a dream scenario, what should happen now? How should we deal with this? How should we treat this differently?
I hope that lots of people will write books using this, reconceiving the authorship of text, what they mean. I worry that it will only be used in the work of those who want to rescue the Judeo-Paulines or the pastorals. I worry that's the only place it's going to get used, because I get those emails. But as I said in the talk, I want to see it used in the interpretation of text, in how we read. I have some chapters in my book about things like how we would reconceive sort of ideas about punishment, if we put that against the backdrop of Roman slavery and how people were punished in the Roman world, and what would this mean? I'd love to see more work on the Pauline epistles and Christian identity. I think of Transbarner's work on this. And I hope there will be lots of books that get published that take this seriously and move beyond this. And I hope that people who have better facility with manuscripts, like Brent and Craig, will incorporate this into the kind of work that they do. But I think we all write books hoping that they're going to change the field. And that rarely happens. I just hope that we don't default to what we always did, because it's easier. Because it is easier. I hope we take the hard, ethical, narrow, high road.
Well, I think this is the stage where we have to wrap up. I'm really sorry about it. Thank you so much, Professor Candida. I mean, this was really fascinating, challenging, illuminating, and for me, sort of outside this field, I'm just sort of, I've been learning and listening, and even though I didn't formulate any questions this time, I've learned so much. So to all of the panelists, to Livy Ingeborg, who's organized so much of this, and to all of our audiences, I just want to say thank you very much. You've really made the annual lecture memorable, and we're very happy to have had you here. And have a wonderful afternoon here in Europe or elsewhere, the time of day that you have. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.